No. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming out to another session of the House Committee on Finance. Some of my members thought I was having a heart attack. I had my hand across my heart, but that was another whole signal. But thank you again for coming out, and thank you, the members, also. Before we get started, the clerk, would you please give us a reading on how many we have? Please call the roll.
Chairman Abney,
Present.
Vice Chair Slater, Vice Chair Marzikowski,
Present.
Representative Amore, Representative Baginski, Representative Barrows, Representative Barrows,
Of course, I'm here, sorry.
okay. Representative Diaz, Representative Edwards, Representative Hull, Representative Adone, Representative O'Brien, Representative Quattrucci,
Present.
Representative Vajero,
Yes, here.
Representative Tabone, and Representative Ella Wilkinson.
Here.
Okay, we have a quorum.
Thank you very much, Clerk. I appreciate that. And again, I appreciate the attendance of all of my members that we work together. It's a very busy time, but I think we're getting things done. This afternoon, we're doing one of two or three things we do, and one is we get briefings on budget articles. As you know, we finally got the budget delivered to us several days ago from the governors, from the executive branch. And what we're doing now for people who are just checking in and for new members on the committee, we go through every single article that's in the budget, and we discuss those in a public manner. And it's very much like a bill in the sense that you get a chance to ask questions and get answers that you need. The one good thing about a briefing like this is that, yes, it's a lot of information, but it gives us, and we grew on each one, it gives us a chance to understand what's in the budget from an analysis point of view from our technical individuals, and then we have to take that and make political decisions from that affect all of our constituents. So those of you who are watching, I like to try to keep you up to date on what we're really doing. Sharon and her crew go through this with a fine-tooth comb. They allow us to ask them questions, and then what we also have on nights that we do have meetings like this, we have people from the executive branch who are standing by, and they're so kind to do that. And if we have questions from them specifically, we're able to ask those questions. And generally, I'll ask that they would come on after Sharon had finished hers, and we finish our questions. And then if they've heard something that they could help us with, they're proud to do that. So with that, Sharon, you could start your presentation as always, please.
Thank you, Chairman, members of the committee. As you mentioned, the staff will go through a presentation we put together on the articles that are before you this evening and try and give you our best explanation of them. And then, of course, you have the administration here to give you their rationale and answer questions as well. Tonight, as it's early in the budget review process, as you mentioned, you did just get the budget about 2 weeks ago. Some of the articles before you tonight are quite familiar. So we started with some that you may have seen before, and so we'll take you through those and answer questions as we go. There are Articles 2, 3, 5, and sections of Article 6 are before you today. Starting with Article 2, there are 8 sections, and we'll take you through each one of those, and then do the same with the other articles. Article 2, you have in the budget almost every year some version of this dealing with indirect cost recovery. And as a reminder, all revenues received by the state are general revenues unless otherwise noted. Some of those can be federal funds, some can be very specifically geared to another use. And so if they're general revenues, there's an indirect cost recovery charge on them for the state's handling expenses. Unless it's prohibited by law, a charitable item, or specifically listed as exempt in state law. And the The state law lists many accounts for each department, and typically every year there's some movement around which accounts are exempt and which aren't, proposals to add new exemptions. The indirect cost recovery represents what we would call overhead charges, similar to those that are allowed on federal grants. For infrastructure and administration, all the money involved in taking the money in, moving it out, paying salaries, etc. So Article 2, Section 6 adds 13 accounts to the list that is exempt from the 10% charge. 7 of these exemptions relate to proposed changes that will be the subject of a future hearing on Article 11 in the agencies listed here. So it's here for informational, but certainly the more salient point of these accounts will be discussed at the Article 11 hearing. Similarly, there are 2 new accounts that would be the subject of hearings in Article 19 and Article 15 that would also be exempt from the indirect cost recovery. Again, the meat of those proposals will be heard on those days. But there are 3 listed that are also the subject of tonight's hearing in Article 2, specific proposals, and that has to do with a grants management proposal, some health insurance assessments, and then a governor's portrait donation fund. One of the items in Article 2 establishes a number of conditions under which the budget officer can create accounts that would otherwise, without this law, require special legislative action. So remember when we started, we said all funds are general revenues unless specifically noted otherwise. That has traditionally taken the form of very specific authorizations for either a fee or a type of revenue to be restricted. So this would allow for conditions whereby the budget officer can create restricted accounts for donated funds, other nonprofit charitable organizations, proceeds from multi-state settlements, or some sort of memorandum of agreement that requires the transfer of funds between entities. It would also allow the budget officer to convert any escrow liability accounts to restricted receipt accounts in consultation with the controller and the auditor general. This last item came about during the fiscal 2019 closing process. There was an analysis conducted of a number of escrow accounts that were ultimately found really not to be activities that would appropriately be classified as escrow. And in that closing, the controller and the auditor general felt they were better represented on the state's books as restricted accounts. And the recommendation before you this year, very similar to last year, is that there be some blanket conversions allowed depending on the situation, and that these accounts all become authorized restricted accounts. So in the case of escrow conversions, there's a handful of items totaling $15 million. There's a number of accounts dealing with donated or nonprofit funds, again, multi-state settlements. So within the budget before you, there are several new accounts that meet the standard outlined in Article 2. If you're not in agreement with the proposals here, you may consider doing them separately, but this is a one way to put them all in groups. One restricted account that we've talked about in the past is the Opioid Stewardship Fund. That was established in 2019 with an assessment for in-state opioid sales, a total of $5 million annually deposited as restricted receipts. What the Article 2 does with respect to this act is that it authorizes the budget officer to create restricted accounts everywhere an agency's been authorized some money to spend out of this fund. And then it clarifies some language around reporting, who has to report how the money is spent. The budgets that include funding from this fund in the governor's proposed 21 revisions, that's consistent with the enacted budget, $3.3 million, and then 22, there are some additional uses. Across the 2 years, the money represents 2 years of receipts plus some leftover funding. But these are the places the governor has proposed to use this money for 22, And what the article would do would say it's okay for the budget officer to create an account in order to have this money flow through it. And that's this section of Article 2. Sections 2 and 3 relative to Article 2 deal with health insurance examination costs. You may recall that under current law, examination of banks and insurance companies are performed by divisions of DBR, and they're subject to an assessment for staff time. Typically what happens is there's an assessment, 150% of the cost of the person doing the work at the time, and those examinations are deposited as general revenues. And under current law, these examinations of health insurers are already authorized. What Article 2 would do is expand the scope of the reimbursement component for only health insurance to include what's being termed pre-exam activities, which are also defined in Article 2. And the proceeds from that assessment go into a new restricted account, essentially to allow for a new position to be added and funded from that. And these particular activities would be billed to the insurer being regulated. Moving on to Section 4, relative to federal grants management. This office was recently transferred from the Office of Management and Budget over to Accounts and Control a couple years ago. And the goal is to improve efficiency of operations, internal controls, and oversight of federal expenses. What Article 2 proposes to do with this office is authorize an assessment on federal funds received into the state. This would be determined by the state controller annually, the percent amount. It would be deposited as a restricted receipt account and support the work of the Office of Federal Grants Management. This would be in addition to the current way the state assesses indirect costs on its federal grants. So as I mentioned, we do it on restricted receipts, but we also require state agencies to get indirect cost recovery on federal grants they handle to the extent allowable. So this would be in addition to that. The proposed use of this fund this fund is expected to generate about $300,000 to be used to support staff in that office. Right now, it's mostly general revenues. There's been some money from the IT fund when there was a project being developed that was dedicated to this staff, but essentially this fills in a hole and allows some additional staff to be paid for. Moving on to sections 5 and 6, you also saw this last year dealing with management and accountability of the budget, and there are 2 sections, and we'll take each one in turn. But as we've talked about before, and I believe this hearing was in July most recently, budget management and oversight are guided by state law. As you know, all your fund sources are included in the budget, and there's any number of formal reporting requirements that are required in order to manage and have oversight over the budget. The closing reports are required to compare budgets by actual line. Any of the items we come to you with is because you have these requirements in law that these be produced. And of course, the budget officer is charged with exercising budgetary control over the state agencies and performing analysis. Again, back in 2019, among the changes you included was that you had provisions to address the administrative adherence to those budget control laws we just talked about. And essentially this required a higher level of scrutiny and monthly reporting if an agency was forecasting a deficit. You may remember that this has been referred to as Article 2 changes. Not coincidentally, it's also a change proposed in Article 2. But it also prohibited the controller from authorizing payments for any new staff, contracts, or purchases for any agency expected to overspend, with exceptions for immediate health and safety. What Section 5 of Article 2 here does is it limits the scope of how those new provisions can be applied. The monthly reporting is only if the quarterly report forecasts only a general revenue deficit. It's currently not limited to general revenues in the law. So if someone was running short of restricted receipts, they wouldn't be required to report to you on how they would close that gap. It also reduces the controller's authority by excluding certain instances, such as if overspending from general revenues is only if overspending from general revenues is not off from the prior fiscal year. And in that case, essentially, it'd be okay to not meet a budget savings initiative as long as you weren't going over a prior year total, or if there's one-time purchases of equipment or supplies. Section 5 also limits the scope in that it would create exceptions to the payment prohibitions. Basically allowing people to overspend if they're trying to institute a corrective action plan. In total, it looks a little more permissive than what was there before 2019 by creating certain situations where entities have a legal authority to spend beyond what's in the budget. Section 6 deals with appropriation authority itself. You have current law talking about the General Assembly's role to appropriate sums as it may deem necessary, and that agencies can't spend without, essentially without that. Section 6 would define appropriation as a statutory enactment by the General Assembly authorizing the withdrawal of money from the state treasury, and then it would exclude from that definition any enactment by the Assembly that doesn't provide the funds, essentially. Section 6 would also say that any general revenues would be deemed appropriated, even if they're not in Article 1, in order to comply with a court order, respond to a state emergency, or cover caseload expenses that are in excess of what was appropriated. So that is the budget authority sections of Article 2. The Highway Maintenance Fund is the subject of Section 7, and Section 7 deals with highway maintenance funds. As some of you longer time members know, that for the past 8 years or so, the Assembly's done a couple of moves to help drive more funding to transportation from the general fund. This included transferring formerly general revenues into a highway maintenance fund. That fund was initially developed for surcharges that were put on licenses and registrations. So all of that money is combined together and serves as resources for transportation projects. But from that, the Public Transit Authority, RIPTA, receives 5% of the revenues. And then in 2017, the Assembly began to provide some additional resources to RIPTA, $5 million, in order to help reinstate the bus pass program and cover some debt for which the authority did not have enough resources. And then again in 2009, that $5 million just became a permanent share, in addition to the 5%. So for 2022, under current law, the authority would get about $9.5 million from these highway maintenance funds. So that's the current situation. What's proposed here is that that $5 million is met through a different way, just this essentially for this time period, because the CARES Act provided $105 million of transit funds to Rhode Island, most of which already went to RIPTA, but about $13 million went to DOT. So Article 2 says that essentially these funds could count towards the fixed $5 million contribution. If DOT gives RIPTA its transit money, DOT can take back some of the money allocated to RIPTA, which is a little more flexible for DOT, and each would get the same amount of money, but it's more flexible use for both entities. So that's what Article 2, Section 7 does. Article 2, Section 8 deals with establishing a new account to receive donations via the Arts Council for governor's portraits not currently in the State House or for any incoming governor. We believe to date the only portraits that are missing would be Governor Raimondo and the current governor. The FY22 budget includes $25,000 each from general revenues and future restricted receipts. The current law also sort of vests the responsibility of this whole process with the Secretary of State. Moving on to Article 3, This is also something you've seen before. This is transferring the employer tax collection responsibilities from the Department of Revenue to the Department of Labor and Training. This includes TDI, caregivers, employment security, job development fund, and the way the language is written is that it gives broad authority for the Law Revision Office of the General Assembly to make the statutory changes needed. This essentially reverses a transfer that was adopted back in 1996. The budget transfers the 35 positions associated with that from DOR to DLT, so no net change with respect to that. And the intent of this is to align the unit with the sources of funds. Back in 96, the intent was to consolidate tax collection functions, and I'll leave it to the administration to speak to whether that ever worked out for them. Apparently, and then the proposal here reverses that. Article 3, Section 2 includes some updates to insurance commissioner standards. This is a hearing you heard back at the end of July. This was originally a bill, then the governor submitted it as a budget amendment in hopes of getting it passed during the calendar year. So it's now been included in the budget again, essentially trying to bring the state into standards for its accreditation, its model language on insurance. Speaking of things you've seen before, Article 3, Section 3 deals with the license plate insurance delay. Current law requires that plates are reissued every 10 years. Hasn't been done since the late 90s. This article delays it again. It was due to be completed June 1. There had been numerous previous delays, but the prior administration didn't approve a new design in time to meet those benchmarks. So this is both a revenue and an expenditure item. Plates are sold to the new recipients, or recipients are charged for each new plate set. That costs a little bit more than the person is charged, because that charge is set in statute and was set quite a while ago and then revised upward recently. But here we are. It's being delayed again. There's a little history here of the delays. I'll just correct that last item. It should say July 2022 for Article 3. So Article 3, Section 4, again, another item you saw last year, transferring the CDL skills testing from CCRI to DMV. This was proposed last year to streamline the process and improve the service, allowing DMV employees to do all the documentation and processing on site. The governor includes some funding. It's expected for to be effective halfway through the fiscal year. The charge of $100 is what's currently collected at CCRI. This moves it into the general fund, and so the user doesn't have a charge difference. Article 3, Section 5 deals with the caseload estimating conference. As you know, and I've talked to you about numerous times, this conference meets twice a year to estimate medical and public assistance programs. The statute also has within it monthly reporting requirements for these expenditures. This is how we're able to do the estimates, track them over time. And then what Article 3 does is it adds the community-based programs for adults with developmental disabilities to the expenses that are being reported, which effectively makes them part of what would be estimated. This would not be effective until essentially the fiscal year FY23. In essentially moving this reporting requirement to the caseload conference, there's another statute that has the current monthly reporting requirement. You have there's a little bit of a date gap left, because one starts 1 year, one's effective immediately. The administration has sent an amendment, I believe I made copies for everybody, that corrects that reporting gap. That was just an oversight. So it's meant to be one replaces the other in a seamless way. We've talked to you before about the reporting requirements currently, and that there's been some compliance issues with those reporting requirements, some of which deals with some of the newer issues that have come into play in terms of additional services provided and whether or not cost of care is being collected and to what extent, and then some of the work requirements. And some of that has to do, which ultimately the state is under a consent decree for community-based day and employment programs. There is a court order with respect to that consent decree that's requiring the state to work for a 3-year budget plan to make sure that it maintains that it comes into and maintains compliance with that consent decree. The idea behind a consistent data collection and reporting requirement to forecast these program costs is included in that court order. The sections 5 and 6 also contain a technical change with who the director, replacing the executive office secretary as where current language has the DHS director about certain responsibilities. That's an artifact of when there wasn't an executive office and when Medicaid was in DHS. Moving on to Article 3, Section 8, the collections unit. This collections unit was established as a 3-year pilot in 2018 to collect debts owed to other agencies that met specific criteria. It was meant to be more expansive than the refund offset program and meant to be for known debts that the departments had difficulty collecting on their own. So Article 3 repeals the sunset date, making this a permanent unit. And the governor assumes $1.4 million of revenues from this operation. The net revenues after expenses would be about $500,000. As originally proposed, this was expected to generate $1.3 million in revenues the first year. About $100,000 was collected. The estimates have really not met the previous projections and are continually revised downward. When the original estimate was revised downward, the 2020 estimate was set at $2 million and then further enhanced by a proposal for new staff. Ultimately, only about $400,000 was collected. And the enacted budget assumed about $1 million. That was revised downward in the November recommendation, although I believe that those estimates are back closer to the original, over $1 million, the actual collections. Currently the only forecast for it meeting the, exceeding the cost is in the 22, but there may be some updated information on that. Moving on to Article 5, temporary borrowing. The Constitution allows the state to borrow in anticipation of tax receipts. We call these tax anticipation notes, or TANs. There are limits, that is 20% of the prior year taxes, essentially, which means the state could be allowed to borrow up over $700 million. That is not the current proposal. But over time, this was not needed in the last several years, but in prior years it was used to a different extent. You can see about a 30-year history here in this graphic. But Article 5 authorizes this borrowing if needed for FY22 up to $300 million. And as you saw in the graph, the last time those type of notes were issued was back in 2012. $200 million was issued. But of course, you also had the Disaster Emergency Funding Board that authorized borrowing up to $300 million just last year. From that authorization, the state drew $35 million. Ultimately, a TANs authorization in the 21 budget replaced this authority, and all the notes were redeemed and the lines of credit were terminated just in the past several weeks. Moving on to Article 6. This article is new in that it proposes to increase the registration fees for the Contractors Registration and Licensing Board from its current 2 years at $200 to $150 per year, essentially $100 more over that 2-year cycle. The impact from this is about $600,000, but not until 2023. Last time this was increased was back in 2007. It went from a 1-year cycle to a 2-year cycle back in 2003. This would reverse that. This would align with the Massachusetts current charges of $150 annually. Also included in Article 6 is technical clarification on roofers. Just to align with the current practice, the initial license is $400, and then the biennial renewal is $200. Also in the governor's requested amendment is some language to make sure that the continuing education requirement for contractors is also split over the 2 years from 5 hours biennially to 2 hours annually. We've talked about the proceeds from the contractors registration licensing boards, most notably in the DBR budget hearings, because some departments were consolidated and expenditures charged to this that didn't seem to totally support the expense, and these new additional revenues would close that gap. Article 6, Section 3 proposes to increase broker-dealer fees to $100. These are fees paid by sales representatives of broker-dealer firms. Massachusetts is at 75, Connecticut is at 125. The last increase was back in 2011. Budget assumes $2.7 million of new general revenues from this. In terms of who pays, the estimate is that only about $100,000 of this fee gets paid by in-state licensees. Article 6, Section 4 is a repeat from last year, and that is authorization for the Department of Health Director to charge fees for processing special data requests. These fees would be established through rules and regulations, exempting state agencies, and also giving the director discretion to waive fees from people who request this. Currently, the department does not charge a fee except for hospital discharge data. It receives hundreds of requests annually. The budget assumes that about half of the funding is provided to the department to help process these requests. The language before you actually says approximately half of the revenues get appropriated to the Department of Health, and that would be to manage and maintain the data systems. That concludes my overview of the articles before you. I'm happy to try and answer any questions, and the staff is also here to assist.
Okay, thank you very much, Sharon. We appreciate that, and as can be appreciated, you can see it's a lot of information, but it's information that we've had before and in this same kind of format. But you always have to refresh yourselves and understand what you're doing. Does anybody have any questions of Sharon at this point? Rep. Wilkinson, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Sharon, for the briefing. I'd like to turn your attention to slide 11, please, on the Opioid Stewardship Fund. And I was wondering if any of those bullets pertain to the purchase of Narcan. Do you know?
Excuse me, the assessment?
No. Do any for manufacturers, wholesalers, distributors? We have $5 million annually set aside in a restricted fund, and I'm just wondering if any of the stewardship funds are put towards the purchase of Narcan.
So it's possible in prior years that was used, and I'll have to get you the exact use. Each year, the proposed uses of it have changed a little bit. So I want to say in 2020 there was some money, but since I don't have it before me, I'm gonna just have to get back to you on exactly how many. It is an allowable use. I will say yes, that's true. And then the question is, does the state dedicate any of this money to that?
Yes.
And I know we had general revenues and federal funds on that. I need to check and see if this was ever used for it.
That'd be excellent, because I know that at least the city of Warwick spends a sizable sum in the purchase of Narcan. So I'm just trying to see if there's any relief or cost sharing from the state for the purchase of Narcan. But we could talk about that offline. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, you're quite welcome. Rep. Devergero, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you, Sharon. So going back to Article 2, which I think you're saying gives this budget officer leeway to create restricted accounts without legislative approval. On slide 15, it assumes .2 million from new restricted receipts beginning fiscal year 2022 for one new FTE at OHIC. Do we know who this $200,000 FTE at OHIC will be, or what this is used for?
Okay, so I just want to clarify that,
Thank you.
that this particular provision of Article 2 creates this particular account. This isn't a budget officer discretion account. This would be one laid out specifically in the statute. And two, it's for, one FTE, and just the cost, I want to say, is about $130,000 for a director of consumer protection to coordinate market analyses and internal investigations and a number of different things.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much. That causes me to ask a question about the same kind of thing. Sharon, on page 4, slide 8, I believe, where it talks about the indirect cost recovery, but also it does seem to me this is establishing condition where the budget officer would be the one who would create these legislative accounts, restricted accounts that we create, if I'm following the logic of that. And so if that's the case, this would be asking us, the legislature, I think, to give up a responsibility that we have, or an action that we have. And I'm just trying to figure out, why do you think that is? I mean, does it save time? Does it save money? Or because it's a legislative function right now, but it looks like this would make it more of an executive function. Am I off track on that?
Well, I think right now you do have the authority. You're the only one who can create them, if you will. If you write into the same law that says you're the only one who create them, the authority for someone else to create them in certain circumstances, yes, it makes it easier for other people to create them and establish them. It's a question of, what level of leeway are you comfortable with, and yeah.
Yeah, well, I'm thinking of times when if there's an overspending issue or something doesn't happen correctly, then it's our job to bring that up and to deal with it. But if I turn this authority over to the executive branch, it seems to me that would end up being their job, but then we wouldn't be doing our job if this happened. And I'm not saying it's a good or a bad idea. I'm just trying to get the mechanics of why that's even needed. And maybe it is.
I mean, I think it's going to come down to the money flowing into the state and how tightly you want to make sure it's controlled. There were decades ago when there were hundreds and hundreds of restricted accounts, and people may have lost sight of them and what they were being used for. There was money left in them. Over time, that was probably cleaned up very tightly, and then they've grown. There are still hundreds of accounts. If they don't get as close a look as general revenues, sometimes you don't probably give them as much scrutiny. So it has to do with the level of scrutiny, balancing that with certain management needs of the executive. So it would be a balance for you to determine what makes the most sense. I mean, I think the audit findings that there were a lot of accounts out there that even the auditors didn't know about, just converting those to restricted might be the appropriate type of account for those that truly are restricted. And then it's a question of, keeping an eye on things that are coming in and going into accounts and how it's been spending, because you do need to include all these expenditures in the budget one way or the other. The question is, do you mechanically also need to create the accounts or create conditions where the accounts can exist?
No, I understand. It just seems to me that listed here are some pretty specific accounts, like donated funds, fund from nonprofit charitable organizations. If it's that specific that's here, then it just gives me pause to ask that question of if it's our job to overlook that, oversee that. I'm just very careful about giving up that authority to do so to another branch. I agree that probably in the past, you know, a lot of things, and probably still are a lot of accounts like that, but it just gives me pause to think that I need a better understanding of why this particular authority that we have, they're asking us to give it up. Did I see your hand up, Chair? Okay. Okay.
Chairman,
Yes. Who?
I do have a question.
Oh, okay.
But at this point in time, I'd like to, I had a question, and
Okay. You know what? Since Scotty, you want to give him a shot at that?
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to know, could I have my attendance recorded? Sorry, I was a little...
Yes, Vice Chair Slater is up, and but no, there were no votes tonight. Yeah, and Rep. Tabone. Okay, Rep. Barrows, you're on with your question, please, sir.
thank you, Mr. Chairman. Sharon, I guess my question, perhaps if you know, if you don't, maybe perhaps the folks who are on the line can help us understand this. The reasoning for shifting the testing from the CCRI to the DMV, what was the rationale for that, if you know?
Yeah, and this was proposed last year too. I think it was an issue of better service for people who participate at the end of the day. That was the idea.
Well, I mean, from my understanding, there's CCRI, there's the DMV, there's the state police who actually participated in this whole process. So what does that mean? So that CCRI and the state police are eliminated from the process, and DMV will do all the testing by themselves and without these other ancillary bodies?
No, I think the idea is that they take the lead, and this is the road testing component only.
Correct, the road test, because right now they do the test, the written test. So they want to just take the whole thing over.
Well, I think the administration can be best to tell you why that works best for them, but it's our understanding that this would be something that would streamline it for the users. But I think I don't want to speak for folks who have proposed this and can talk to you about why they did one thing and not another.
Thank you, Sharon. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. Are there any other questions from the panel here for Sharon? Okay, what we will do now is that Director Warmer, Jonathan Warmer of the Office of Management Budget, is a great friend and a good ally in helping us understand this. As we normally do, I'll ask him to take the lead on the presenters and people he have here. They're there from the administration to answer any questions that we have. And what I like to do is if he's heard some questions or someone has, that he can get those done. At the same time, give us a brief introduction and handle his crew there the way that he wishes. And as you can see, we're being brought back up to speed on a number of things that, that we knew last year, but it would be nice if the directors that are there with Director Warmer would give us a little brief reason why, if something that's either under their purview or coming under their purview is something we should do. And I don't think that will take a long time, but it will go a long way in helping us understand what we're doing. So, Director Warmer, are you there, sir?
I am, Chairman. Can you hear me okay?
I sure can. Welcome aboard. Here we go, huh?
Yeah, once again.
Well, thank you.
I'm certainly happy to be here. And bear with me to your point. This is kind of Articles 2 and 3 sort of by their nature are a little bit grab bag in terms of topics. So we certainly have a lot of people here from the administration. So I'm going to try to go through some of the questions that you and your colleagues asked that are mine, and then turn it over to some of my other colleagues on various topics. But you don't hesitate to rein me in if you've got some more questions as I talk, and we'll just kind of go from topic to topic if that's okay with you.
That's fine. Please proceed.
Certainly. So I guess I'll start with your question, Chairman, about the restricted accounts and the escrow liability accounts. So these are two provisions that you currently granted us, I think, in Article 1 temporarily in the current fiscal year, and I think they've gone pretty well. The escrow liability accounts were, you know, as the fiscal staff said, had to do with problems identified by the Legislative Auditor General. That we're trying to convert them to the right account. Just so you know, an escrow liability account is really supposed to be just a holding place to keep money. It's not a place to spend money out of. You can sort of like a good example, I mean, good conceptual example, I don't know that we actually do it this way, but a good conceptual example would be bail. Somebody hands over money to you, but then they get it back after they've shown up to court, and you as an entity don't really get to spend it unless a violation of some kind or some action takes place, and then it would be transferred in as a revenue. But I think in the past, over a long period of time, some things were, some of those escrow liability accounts were being used as restricted receipt accounts from 10, 20 years ago, and that really bothers the accountants and auditors because it really messes with how they report things for governmental accounting standards. On the restricted accounts, I guess I want to assure you these are relatively small things. Right now we're getting hundreds of millions of dollars into the federal government, and the executive branch, they are putting them in accounts. Right now, on sort of the current discretion that we have, because the money certainly has to go somewhere, and it wouldn't be very practical not to put it somewhere otherwise. These things in particular we're talking about here, mostly around donations, in particular, nonprofit funds, is when the state's approached about adding money to a program or a donation like the portrait money, if we don't have an account to put it in that enables spending, then we can't necessarily really meet the terms of the charitable donation. So let's say a charitable organization comes in September, there's not going to be any legislative action on creating new accounts for 9 months. We either have to turn away the donation or tell the charitable organization they have to kind of waive certain rights because we don't have the ability to accept the money under the terms that they would give it to us. So it is a convenience, but it also enables us to have an actual interaction with some of these small dollar figures that allow us to accept things. So if you're not comfortable with some of these topics, I'd leave some of them out. If you want to make it a dollar limit, I think that's perfectly acceptable, something that's small dollar. But right now, especially on the donation and nonprofit giving side to state government, if we don't have some flexibility on this, then we often might be put in a spot where we can't accept them. So that was really just the only logic there. It wasn't meant to be certainly anything large. The multi-state settlement is really there just because when the court concludes and there's a settlement, sometimes those funds might have conditions. Some of those conditions might be to be spent on a particular thing within a particular period of time. Then when you wait for months for a legislative action, then we might be in violation of the court. So that's kind of the logic for those sort of things. I certainly don't mind any other conditions or specificity on it if the legislature so pleases. But we just don't want to be in a position where the state has to turn things away. I guess I'll touch briefly on some of the other Article 2 fund changes. We suggested these last year as well with regard to the restrictions. the items regarding any sort of overspend on general revenue versus other sort of receipts, we kind of understand or understood from the committee that the intent was to focus on general revenues and not shut down the agencies if they have a restricted receipt deficit. So we're just trying to be specific here, that it's in the total of the agency rather than the program. That's something else that's just not clear from the existing statute. And often we're asked to execute corrective action plans to deal with deficits that require spending some money. And so we're just trying to be clear about that. On the issue of funds that are appropriated, a little bit like at least the restricted accounts, we're seeking sort of the appropriation of any funds that might be required through court order. There are often, unfortunately, the state is involved in court actions, and sometimes those require the state to pay penalties. And I think now, given the Article 2 changes, without something specific from the legislature, we wouldn't be unable to pay court payment without an appropriation directly from the General Assembly. So we might have to call an emergency session or possibly be in contempt of court. It's one of the more common sort of discretions the executive branch gets just because of the timing issue and sometimes the not understanding of the court that there are separation of branches. And in particular also the caseload, since there's a relatively straightforward process on that. If the caseload projections go dramatic in a particular year, this is particularly important in times when there's a possible fiscal downturn. We want to make sure we can still pay those federally mandated programs. I don't know, the definition for appropriation is in there because a couple of years ago we had an issue where general law suggested a rate was to increase, but the Appropriations Act didn't fund it, and we all had a bit of confusion about whether we were supposed to pay that rate increase or not. This is my attempt to try to make that clear, that if it's not in the Appropriations Act, it is not funded, and the Appropriations Act is the singular place to look to see what the General Assembly has appropriated throughout general law, unless appropriation is used specifically in general law. So just to make it very, very clear. I'll touch on the TANs issue. It's very, very unlikely we would need to execute a TANs right now. You know, we have over $500 million in cash, and this is usually one of our low points in the state. With all the federal money, we do have a lot of cash on hand. However, it just seems prudent in the midst of a recession, in the midst of a lot of uncertainty and surprises that we've all gone through, just to have this authorization for the upcoming fiscal year. God forbid that something else catches us unaware in these trying times. That concludes the pieces I wanted to focus on, and I would turn it over to some of my colleagues on some other specific topics. But I'll pause there and see if you have any questions on the items that I touched on.
Yeah, I think we're good on questions for you at this point.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes. I'm sorry.
This is Rep. Barrows. I did have a follow-up question for Jonathan, if I could, in reference to your question.
You absolutely can.
So, Jonathan, if I understood you correctly, you said some time ago that we relinquished some of that, that authority to you. Is that over the period when the COVID money was being administered by the governor?
Well, in the budget that was adopted in December, I think Article 1, for instance, granted us the ability to convert escrow accounts and to take donations. I don't have Article 1 sitting right in front of me, so I would certainly defer to fiscal staff if they end up pulling that up. But it, it's only active for the budget year. It's not a permanent activity, and so it's really just for those small pieces. And so we're just asking that get converted to general law and permanent.
Yeah, I guess my only concern is, again, to echo back what the chairman had said, is that it's within our purview, and it feels a little bit uncomfortable that the administration is saying that they want to take this over, given that we actually had an awful lot of question from at least from our constituency as to why we didn't really have more say in how the COVID money was being spent. So I just had, that was just my concern. Yeah, no,
I totally understand that, and that's a discussion. Although these would not play into that. These are for donations, and they're not for federal funds.
Okay, thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Oh, okay, you're quite welcome. I'm looking at my screen. I want to make sure I don't miss anybody else. I know Rep. Quattrochi is on the screen at some point, but I don't think I didn't see him raise his hand for anything. So just want to be sure I don't miss anybody who's on the screen. We have people in the studio and people who are via WebEx. So I want to be sure of that. And it's Rep. Barros, I really apologize for not seeing you raise your hand. Next time, just really shake it really hard, and I think I'll see it at that point. Okay, great. Yeah, Jonathan, I think that probably helped on what you were doing. What you could do at this point, Jonathan, if some of the other members that you have with you had a part of the of the presentation that they just wanted to give a couple of minute overview on why it's needed in there, that would be very helpful, I think.
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. So I guess I'd like to first turn it over to Nina Savage of our tax administrator at DOR to talk also with Matt Weldon, the acting director at DLT, to talk about the transfer of employer tax.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Jonathan. Thank you. And thank you, Chairman Abney and members of the committee. I just want to lend my strong support to Article 3, Section 1, which is the transfer of the employer tax unit from the Division of Taxation to the Department of Labor and Training. We think it makes a lot of sense, both organizationally, fiscally, and ultimately it's in the best interest of the taxpayer. Just briefly, the employer tax unit is federally funded. It's tied by technology, the mainframe system, to the Department of Labor and Training. We do the tax collection, they do the administration of the 3 programs. And so it makes a lot of fiscal, financial, organizational, technological sense. They're also part of a separate union. And I think in 1996, it may have made a lot of sense, but as we've evolved, I think there's a need at DLT, and I'll let Director Weldon speak to that, but just please note my strong support for this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We got Director Weldon coming up. Matt?
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Chairman, it's nice to be here in this capacity for the first time. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
My colleague, Nina Savage, said it well, and Sharon laid it out perfectly. This is something that was established in the 90s in an effort to centralize, to create efficiencies. And unfortunately, for whatever reason, it seems to be less efficient than it should be. Really, you have a DLT unit that is entirely funded by DLT, but unemployment, temporary disability, and job development fund that only does DLT functions, and the members are members of a DLT that all work at revenue. For ease of management and for the administration to be able to run the programs effectively without having to have both agencies involved in every single detail, I think it makes a lot of sense for us to be more responsive to the taxpayer and responsible forward.
Okay, thank you, Matt. Do we have any questions from anyone on the panel or out in the stratosphere here? You pretty good, JB, on anything you needed? Okay, I don't have any questions of you, but so thank you very much. Okay?
Mr. Chairman, I'd
Yes.
like to turn it over, if that's okay, to Ed Murray to talk about the Central Collections Unit and their projections in the current year for collections and what the future looks like.
Thank you so much. We'll bring Ed on right now. Ed?
Ed, are you there?
Oh, yeah. Maybe he was there, huh? I can hear you, Ed. Yes, I can.
Can you hear me, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I can. There you are. I can see you also.
Okay. Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you regarding the Article 3 provision, whereby we're looking for the elimination of the June 30th, 2021 sunset clause. The slides that you looked at earlier were based on data which came from November. And it's critical that the committee realize that each month since then, the Central Collections Unit has been able to raise revenue such that this fiscal year, we now have raised $1,269,721. As a matter of fact, just this month in March, we are very close to raising $500,000 in delinquent debt on behalf of 19 state agencies. The reason for the noticeable increase is that we increased the number of collection letters we've been sending out per week from 500 to 1,500. We have also done research on the addresses that we've received from the agencies of the debtors, such that we've been able to use corrected addresses for about 200 debtors per week. And also because we've entered agreements with an additional number of state agencies and subunits within those agencies, we have been able to, frankly, through the efforts of our staff and a lot of work, tremendously increase the revenue on the state agencies. We look at our unit as an enforcement unit, whereby we're an arm of these client agencies in enforcing their administrative orders and enforcing court judgments. And it's important that this unit continue operating because it's fair to the people of Rhode Island who pay their fees, pay for violations, pay restitution, that our unit uses its resources to go after debtors who are delinquent and aren't making their payments. And as we get out of COVID, what we're hoping for is that we will be able to continue bringing these actions in court in addition to our collection letters. We have 88 matters pending in State District Court and Superior Court, and we have approximately 30 to 50 additional complaints that we will be filing in April and May. But these are all matters that require in-person hearings in court because most of the people, most of the debtors, are individuals who are not represented by counsel. And there's a due process issue there. There's an issue with respect to the courts and whether or not they're actually going to show up. It becomes a practical problem. Most of these individuals do not want to participate in any type of Zoom or WebEx hearing, and for that reason, we need in-person hearings. But the main point I wanted to get across to the committee was that the slides that were being used previously, although they're accurate, they're only that time period from July through November. And we have shown a tremendous amount of progress in raising revenue from delinquent debts. And frankly, we'd like the opportunity to present the committee with additional slides that update all of this information. And we can present that information to the committee by next Monday. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you so much. We're glad that you guys are working and making it happen. If you have some information that you need to send us slides or something like that, you certainly can. We can take a look at that. Just send it over to our clerk here, and we'll put that into the record for you. Okay, but thanks for all you do. Jonathan, who do you have up next, sir? You're welcome.
So I'd like to turn over to Bud Craddock just to talk briefly about a couple of things, including the...
Yes, how was that? Oh, no, I was... Oh.
They're working it out.
Yeah, working it out. Bud?
Thanks, Jonathan. Good evening, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee.
Good evening.
I'm Bud Craddock, Administrator for the Division of Motor Vehicles, and I want to take this opportunity to say thank you for the opportunity to speak. And it's great to actually see people on WebEx rather than just speaking on a telephone. We have two articles, two sections under Article 3 tonight, the CDL testing and the license plate reissuance. And if I may, I'll take the CDL testing first. Rep. Barrows, who from the great city of Pawtucket, my old hometown. Had I still lived there, he'd be representing me. So he asked a question earlier about why take over. And just to clear it up, state police has nothing to do with the CDL testing in the state of Rhode Island. We administer the knowledge testing and all the endorsements that the CDL drivers have to go through. Then they take a road test that has been administered by the Community College of Rhode Island down in Quonset. While it has worked good over the years, we believe that it will be an easier and stronger process if the DMV takes us over completely. If you follow the process, what we do, currently they'll go down there, and if they arrive at the road test facility in Quonset and they don't have a permit, or if they're missing one of the documents they need, their road test is canceled. They have to come back for another day. But if these were DMV employees administering the road test, they could access the DMV system and be able to process the transaction fully right there at the road test site. And lastly, under the current system, they will take the road test, they'll get a passing grade and a certificate, and then he would have to come back to one of the DMV facilities. Usually, they have to come to Cranston, to the CDL site on the third floor, to get their actual license. Under the new process that we envision, they would be able to walk away from the site with their actual license without having to go to another facility. So it'll be a more streamlined process, it'll be more efficient, and we will be able to be more customer friendly. I believe the CCRI Associate Vice President for Administration, Alix Ogden, has submitted a letter in support of this, and I don't know if they've submitted it, but I've been authorized to speak and say that Chris Maxwell of the Rhode Island Truckers Association supports this process, as well as Bill Roche from the First Student School Bus Organization is in support of it. And I would also say that we've spoken to the local office of the FMCSA, the Federal Motor Carriers Safety Administration, who are also in support of this transition from CCRI to the DMV. And if my recollection serves me correct, Rep. Fellow Wilkerson asked the question last year that if we bring on 3 FTEs to the DMV, what would happen to those people at the CCRI? And I believe those positions would be eliminated. However, the individuals that are there now naturally would have a preference for their positions coming over to the DMV. I would be willing to answer any questions on that budget article before I move on to the license plate reissuance.
Okay, thank you very much, Bud. Is there any questions? Rep. Barrett, are you good?
Yeah, no, I just wanted to thank Director Craddock for actually, clarifying the process. Thank you, Chairman.
Oh, thank you very much. Want to be sure. Okay, okay, Bud, you can go to your next one now, please.
All right, the other one was the license plate reissuance. License plate reissuance, as Sharon explained, has been being pushed forward over multiple administrations. Our new governor has put it down for July of 2021. DMV is ready and willing whenever we get the go-ahead to move forward with the license plate reissuance. A couple provisions is that our technology or our manufacturing partner, 3M, who makes the actual sheeting for the license plates, needs a minimum of 7 months lead time to be able to manufacture and get ready for the actual distribution of the sheeting so that we can make the plates. So right now, currently, the July of 2022 gives us ample time to develop the plate design that the new governor wants to distribute as a new plate design, and then to work with 3M to make samples so that we can bring those samples forward to the state police so they can make sure that they meet the proper visibility standards so that they are able to see, they or other law enforcement agencies are able to see them under the different light situations that are seen on a normal street. And also, if an individual sees a plate going by and they have to identify it as a witness to some sort of an incident, they're able to see it under the different lighting situations. So if anyone has any questions, again, I'm happy to answer those.
Thank you, Bud. We really appreciate that, both your presentations. Are there any questions from anyone for Bud, please? Okay, don't see any, so thanks very much. Okay, Jonathan, you seal up with your next person.
My pleasure, Mr. Chairman. Have a good evening.
You have a great one yourself, sir. Okay.
So,
Jonathan,
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to turn it over to Anna Nevice just to answer briefly, I think, the question that was asked about Narcan.
Okay.
And then anything else you'd like to mention.
Okay, thank you very much. Anna?
Yes, good afternoon or good evening. I'm not sure anymore of the time. But yes, the question regarding Narcan, we had not used this year's funds from the state's stewardship fund, the Opioid Stewardship Fund, to purchase Narcan because we've used other federal funding sources. We've been very strategic about how to use it, and we always prioritize when we had federal funds. So Narcan was purchased with federal funds, with Recovery Act funds also, and then distributed through the Department of Health, through the BHDDH partners, and also there's another funding that comes through URI. We have a chart that I can send after through Director Warmer and folks that will give you very specific details of how we distribute and the different funding streams that we used.
Thank you so much. I think it was Rep. Bella Wilkerson that was interested in that particular question, but we'll make sure she gets that. And if you have, again, any other information that you can send to us, that would be absolutely great. Are there any other questions of the doctor before she takes off? Okay, thank you very much. We really appreciate that. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good to see you all.
It's good to be seen. Okay, Jonathan.
So, Mr. Chairman, I think that concludes all the topics we wanted to hit on proactively, but certainly we have others here from the Department of Health. Neil, did you have something to say?
Sure. Thank you, Director, and thank you, Chairman.
Hi, Neil.
Just wanted to discuss Article 6, Section 4, and thank you for your consideration of it tonight. What the section would allow the department to do, as many other states have done and are doing, is charge for work that the staff has done to provide specialized data for private entities. So increasingly, RIDO Center for Health Data and Analysis is being asked to conduct in-depth analysis and create specific data reports for entities, private entities such as hospital systems, health plans, and other institutions that may be conducting research that takes a significant amount of our staff's time. So we believe allowing RIDO to charge for some of the work that this team does is a fair way to support that center's work and keep up with these increasing requests, respond in a timely manner, and allow them to continue to do the work that they do to support state initiatives. So with that, I'm also joined by the Chief of that center, Sam Vinerbrown, in case the committee has any specific questions.
Neil, thank you for all the work that you guys are doing over to the Department of Health. It's a tremendous job, and I think the entire state should be glad that we got people like yourself doing that. So we really appreciate that. Are there any questions?
Thank you.
So I don't think there's any question for you. And you said you had someone else, Sam Brown, for a comment or two?
Yeah, Sam is chief of our center, and she's happy to answer any questions that you folks might have.
Yes.
Yes, Sam, did you want to make a statement? I don't think there are any questions from the panel at this point, but we certainly would like your input if you wanted to speak on a couple of the articles that we have here.
Just the article, the section 4 is the one that has to do with data fees, and as Neil mentioned, we in the Center for Health Data Analysis receive multiple data requests, and they've been increasing over time. Some are fairly complicated, require staff time, and it would just be very helpful to charge for some of the work that we do. We have looked at other states as well and have seen that this is somewhat common among other states to charge for staff time to prepare the data requests.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I don't think we have any other questions for yourself either, so we'll just move right ahead. Jonathan, what do you have next?
So I think my motley crew here should chime in if I get this wrong, but I think this concludes our all our proactive statements. But certainly, if there's other questions that are lingering, we're happy to stay as long as you like to answer anything on the articles.
Well, thank you, Jonathan, as usual. I think that exhausts the question that we would have for this evening.
Chairman?
Yes. There we go.
I keep waving. I don't think, we need to make the icon a little bit bigger.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, yeah, you have small hands. That's why I don't see you. That's you got to have. Okay, JB.
Mr. Chairman, I just had just a clarification for a question for clarification for Jonathan. So, Jonathan, if I'm correct, so the information that Ed was providing to us in terms of the collection unit, he was referring to the collection unit we created some time ago to collect some of the back due taxes, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so I didn't really want to ask him the question if it was the wrong collection unit. So in reference to that collection unit, I didn't, and Sharon would forgive me for this, but in terms of what the collection unit has collected versus what the collection unit costs, can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, so the collection unit costs a little under $700,000, and I think, as Ed talked about, this year they've collected $1.2 million. Ed, correct me if I've got that wrong.
Well, it might be good. I just wanted some clarification, Jonathan, but that's, that was the question, because I didn't know if it was the same collection unit. Thank you very much, Chairman, and thank you, Jonathan.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you very much, JP. And he's correct. I know Sharon is not going to forgive him for not getting that particular one right. But it's a great question. I appreciate that. I did see some of the numbers today, and what you were just told is pretty close to that. So, okay. I don't think there are any other questions, Jonathan. Thank you so much for your staff and yourself tonight. We will be getting to know each other a lot in the future. So if you had any new persons that were with you tonight, just tell them we'll get to know each other on a first name basis as we go through this process. But we couldn't do it without the help of everybody that's on your panel. So thank you very much. Now, if there are no other questions from anybody outside the building or inside the building, that really should conclude the business. Do we have one on the phone? Okay, we got one call on the phone. I want to make sure. Okay. Okay, hello, you're on with House Finance. Could you tell us who you are, please? Who is it?
Thank you, Chair Abney. This is Leanne Byrne, the Deputy Chief of Staff for Treasurer Magaziner.
Okay, good. How are you?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Great, great. Okay, you're on.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Chairman, and thank you, members of the committee. Again, this is Leanne Byrne, Deputy Chief of Staff to Treasurer Magaziner. I'm here to testify in support of the administration's request to authorize short-term borrowing to ensure the continued stability of the state's cash position throughout the fiscal year. This is included in Article 5, the Tax Anticipation Notes article. As Sharon went through, and as you will all recall, last year the COVID-19 pandemic resulted in a sudden drop in state revenues, and there was uncertainty in the timing and amount of federal aid to states. This forced the Disaster Emergency Funding Board to have to convene late March of last year to authorize $300 million in short-term borrowing to ensure the stability of the state's cash position. Disaster Emergency Funding Board's authorization was replaced by a TAN's authorization in the FY21 budget. Our current cash flow projections incorporate the November Revenue Estimating Conference and the infusion of federal stimulus funds. In this scenario, the budget forecast, the cash forecast projects a positive cash balance for all of FY22. But if faced with another unanticipated emergency, this TAN's authorization would provide stability to the cash position and ensure that we can secure the lowest possible interest rate. I'm happy to take any questions about this, as well as our current cash position and the Disaster Emergency Funding Board authorization. Thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely, and we thank you so much for all the work you do in the Treasurer's Office, and give our regards to the Treasurer. Are there any questions at this point? You did it so well. There are no questions at this point, so thank you very much. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, take good care. Good evening. Okay, I think that exhausts the telephone list tonight, which is a good thing. So if no other further questions, that then will end the business of the Finance Committee tonight. Thank you very much.